The year is 1241. Europe stands on the edge of oblivion. From the east, a storm unlike anything the continent has ever witnessed rolls across the frozen plains. Cities burn, kingdoms crumble. Armies that have stood for generations are swept away like dust before a hurricane. The Mongols, the most fearsome military machine the world has ever known, are coming. And nothing, it seems, can stop them. But in a small fortified town in the heart of Moravia, something unexpected is about to happen. Something that will change the course of history. This is the story of Olomouc, a fortress that should have fallen in days, a garrison that should have been massacred, and a secret that would save Central Europe from total annihilation. This is the story of how one city's walls became the graveyard of an empire's ambitions. To understand what happened at Olomouc, we must first understand what was coming toward it. The Mongol Empire in 1241 was not just another conquering army. It was a phenomenon that had reshaped the entire known world in barely 2 decades. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols had built an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the doorstep of Europe. An empire larger than Rome at its height, larger than Alexander's conquests, larger than anything humanity had ever seen. The man leading the Mongol forces into Europe was Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan himself. He commanded an army that historians estimate numbered somewhere between 60,000 and 120,000 warriors, though the exact figure remains debated to this day. What is not debated is their effectiveness. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the product of the most sophisticated military system on earth, trained from childhood to ride, shoot, and kill with terrifying efficiency. Every Mongol warrior was a cavalryman, capable of covering over 60 miles in a single day. Each man rode with multiple horses, switching between them to maintain speed over incredible distances. They carried composite bows that could pierce armor at 200 yards, and they could shoot accurately from horseback at full gallop. One Persian chronicler who witnessed their campaigns wrote, "They appeared like demons, and the arrows falling from their bows were like rain descending from the heavens. I saw men struck down before they could even draw their swords, and horses collapsing with 3 or 4 shafts buried in their flesh." But it was not just their individual skill that made the Mongols unstoppable. It was their organization, their discipline, their tactical brilliance. They fought in units of 10, which combined into units of 100, then 1,000, then 10,000. Every man knew his place. Every unit knew its role. They could execute complex maneuvers across miles of battlefield with a precision that European armies would not match for centuries. And they had a psychological weapon that was perhaps even more devastating than their bows: terror. The Mongols understood that fear could win battles before a single arrow was fired. When they approached a city, they offered surrender. Those who submitted immediately were often spared, incorporated into the empire, allowed to continue their lives under Mongol rule. But those who resisted, those who dared to defy them, they were annihilated. Every man, woman, and child put to the sword, their city burned to ashes, the very ground salted so nothing would grow there again. And the Mongols made sure that everyone knew about it. Refugees fleeing from destroyed cities spread tales of horror that paralyzed entire regions with dread. By early 1241, the Mongols had already carved through Eastern Europe like a knife through cloth. In April of that year, they had won 2 devastating victories that should have ended any organized resistance. At the Battle of Legnica, in present-day Poland, a combined force of Polish knights, German crusaders, and Templar warriors was utterly destroyed. Duke Henry II of Silesia, who led the Christian forces, was killed along with most of his army. The Mongols cut off the ears of the dead to count their casualties, and contemporary sources claim they filled 9 large sacks with them. Just 2 days later, on April 11th, 1241, came an even greater catastrophe at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary. Here, King Bela IV of Hungary assembled what historians believe was the largest army Hungary had ever fielded, somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 men. The Mongols, commanded by Batu Khan, and the legendary General Subutai, one of the greatest military commanders in human history, didn't just defeat this army, they annihilated it, using a feigned retreat to draw the Hungarians into a trap, then surrounding them with a perfectly executed pincer movement. The Mongols systematically slaughtered the Hungarian forces. Contemporary estimates, though certainly exaggerated, claim that as many as 40,000 Hungarians died. What is certain is that the Kingdom of Hungary effectively ceased to exist as a military power in a single afternoon. One Hungarian survivor later wrote, "I saw the flower of our nobility cut down like wheat before the scythe. The earth was so covered with bodies that one could walk upon them as upon a carpet for the length of several fields. The river ran red with blood for 3 days, and the screaming of the dying filled the air from sunrise to sunset and beyond." After Mohi, Central Europe lay open. The road to Vienna, to Prague, to the wealthy cities of the German principalities, it was all undefended. The Holy Roman Empire was fractured into dozens of competing states, incapable of mounting a unified defense. The Pope called for a crusade, but the response was pitiful. Everyone knew what was coming, and everyone knew that no one could stop it. But the Mongols had a problem that would become critical at Olomouc. Their incredible mobility and speed came at a cost. Unlike European armies, which could rely on supply trains and foraging from settled agricultural lands, the Mongol army needed vast amounts of pasture for their massive herds of horses. Each warrior required multiple mounts, and the army as a whole needed tens of thousands of horses, perhaps even exceeding 100,000 animals depending on which estimates you trust. These horses needed to graze, and they needed to graze constantly. This meant that the Mongol advance was shaped not just by military considerations, but by environmental ones. They moved in spring and summer when grass was plentiful. They split their forces to prevent overgrazing. They planned their campaigns around the availability of pasture as much as around strategic targets, and they were absolutely dependent on keeping their army mobile. A stationary Mongol army was a starving Mongol army. This is where Olomouc enters our story. The city was not particularly large by the standards of the great European capitals. It was not fabulously wealthy like Venice or Genoa. It did not command vast territories like Paris or London. But it had something that would prove far more valuable: walls, strong walls, and a garrison determined to hold them. Olomouc sat in the region of Moravia, in what is now the Eastern Czech Republic. It was the second most important city in the Kingdom of Bohemia after Prague itself, a prosperous trading center positioned on the Morava River. The city had been fortified for centuries, with thick stone walls, multiple defensive towers, and a castle complex that dominated the surrounding countryside. Within those walls lived somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people, craftsmen and merchants, clergy and nobles, all now trapped as the Mongol horde approached. The garrison defending Olomouc was not enormous. Historical sources suggest it numbered between 1,000 and 1,500 men, though exact figures are impossible to verify. These were not professional soldiers in the modern sense. Many were local militia, townsmen who had trained with weapons but whose primary occupations were as bakers, blacksmiths, and traders. But they had something the Mongols had not encountered much in their European campaign: experienced commanders who understood siege warfare. The Bishop of Olomouc at this time was Bruno von Schauenburg, a German nobleman who had seen combat before. His military commander was Yaroslav of Sternberg, a Czech noble with a reputation as a capable warrior and tactician. Together, they made a decision that would define everything that followed. They would not surrender, they would not flee, they would hold. When scouts reported the Mongol approach in late March, or early April 1241, the exact dates are disputed by historians. The people of Olomouc had only days to prepare. The countryside around the city was evacuated. Livestock were driven inside the walls or scattered into the forests. Crops that could not be harvested were burned. Every well outside the walls was poisoned or filled with stones. Anything that could aid the Mongols was destroyed. Inside the city, preparations went on day and night. Every able-bodied person was put to work. Food stores were inventoried and rationed. The walls were inspected and repaired where necessary. Weapons were distributed. Stone projectiles were stockpiled on the walls. Cauldrons were prepared for boiling water and heated sand. Crossbow bolts were manufactured by the thousands. The citizens of Olomouc knew what was coming, and they knew their only chance was to make the city so difficult to take that the Mongols would give up and move on. And then, one spring morning, they appeared on the horizon. A mounted patrol first, light cavalry scouts moving with the easy confidence of men who had conquered half the world. Then more and more, until the fields around Olomouc seemed to writhe with horsemen, their banners snapping in the wind, their armor glinting in the sun. One defender later recalled, "It was as though the earth itself had opened and vomited forth an army of devils. There were so many of them that their horses trampled the new wheat flat, and the dust they raised could be seen from the walls like a brown cloud covering the world." The Mongols did not attack immediately. They surrounded the city, cutting off all routes of escape, all possibility of reinforcement. They sent envoys to the gates, demanding surrender. The message was clear: open your gates, swear loyalty to the great Khan, and your lives will be spared. Resist, and every soul in the city will die screaming. Bishop Bruno's response has been recorded by several chroniclers. He appeared on the walls, in full view of the Mongol commanders, and declared, "We are Christians, and we will not bow to pagans. Our trust is in God and in these walls. Do your worst." The siege had begun. Now, you might be wondering, what made Olomouc different from the dozens of other cities the Mongols had already taken in their relentless march across Eurasia? After all, the Mongols were not just masters of mobile warfare. They were also experts at siegecraft. During their conquest of China, they had learned from the greatest siege engineers in the world. They had massive siege towers, catapults, and mangonels that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds. They had used these weapons to break open fortified cities from Beijing to Baghdad. So why did Olomouc hold? The answer lies in a combination of factors, some military, some geographical, some simply down to timing and luck. But there was one element that proved decisive, one weapon that the defenders of Olomouc possessed, that turned their walls into an impenetrable barrier. And to understand that weapon, we need to talk about the reality of siege warfare in the 13th century. Sieges were brutal, grinding affairs. There were no quick victories, no brilliant tactical maneuvers that could instantly crack open a well-defended city. It came down to patience, resources, and willpower. The attacker had to either break the walls, starve the defenders into submission, or find some weakness, a gate that could be forced, a section of wall that could be mined and collapsed. The Mongols, for all their skill, faced a fundamental problem at Olomouc that they had not fully anticipated. Their siege engines, while formidable, required specific materials and significant time to construct. They needed timber for frames, rope for the throwing arms, skilled craftsmen to assemble them properly. In the steppes and plains where the Mongols originated, where they had honed their tactics over generations, these materials were often scarce, which is partly why they became such masters of mobile warfare in the first place. But in Central Europe, timber was plentiful, and the Mongols had captured craftsmen from conquered cities who knew how to build these weapons. So, they began construction on several large catapults and at least one siege tower, a massive wooden structure that could be wheeled up to the walls, allowing attackers to storm the ramparts at height. The construction took weeks, and those weeks were critical, because while the Mongols were building their siege engines, several things were happening that would ultimately doom their campaign. First, their horses were suffering. The pastures around Olomouc were not sufficient to support an army of this size for an extended period. The grass was being eaten faster than it could regrow. Horses began to lose condition, becoming weaker, slower, more susceptible to disease. And without their horses, the Mongols were just men on foot, stripped of their greatest advantage. Second, the defenders of Olomouc were using their time well. They had prepared thoroughly before the siege began, but now they refined their defenses even further. They strengthened weak points in the walls. They organized rotation schedules so that fresh troops were always manning the ramparts. They conducted drills to ensure that everyone knew exactly what to do when the attack came. And they prepared their secret weapon. That weapon was not some exotic Eastern technology or ancient Roman secret recovered from dusty manuscripts. It was something much simpler, much more practical, and ultimately much more effective. It was the crossbow. Now, crossbows were not unknown to the Mongols. They had encountered them in China and other regions. But the crossbows, being manufactured in Olomouc during those weeks of preparation, were particularly effective examples of the weapon. European crossbows of this period were powerful enough to punch through the lamellar armor worn by Mongol warriors at ranges up to 200 yards. They required less training to use effectively than the complex composite bows favored by the Mongols. And critically, they could be operated from behind fortifications where the shooter was protected. The defenders of Olomouc had hundreds of crossbows and thousands of bolts. They positioned them along the walls at regular intervals, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach to the city. They trained their militia extensively in reloading and shooting, turning shopkeepers and craftsmen into deadly accurate marksmen. And they waited. The Mongol assault, when it finally came, was ferocious. Sources are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, as they often are for medieval events, but we can reconstruct the general outline of what happened. The Mongols began with an artillery bombardment, using their completed catapults to hurl stones at the walls. The stones smashed into the fortifications with tremendous force, but the walls of Olomouc had been built to withstand such punishment. Some sections cracked, some stones were dislodged, but the walls held. Then came the infantry assault. This was unusual for the Mongols, who preferred to fight from horseback, but siege warfare demanded different tactics. Waves of warriors, many of them conscripts from conquered peoples rather than ethnic Mongols, rushed forward, and this is where the crossbows proved their worth. The defenders let the attackers get close enough that even relatively inexperienced crossbowmen could not miss. Then they opened fire. One chronicle describes it as a rain of iron falling on the Mongol forces. Crossbow bolts punched through armor, through shields, through flesh and bone. Men fell screaming, tumbling from ladders, collapsing in heaps at the base of the walls. The Mongols were not accustomed to this. In open field battles, their mobility allowed them to avoid concentrated fire, to wheel and retreat and attack from unexpected angles. But in a siege, there was nowhere to hide, no room to maneuver. They had to come straight at the walls, and every step forward was through a lethal barrage of crossbow fire. One defender, a Czech townsman, whose account was later recorded by a monk, described the experience. "I was terrified beyond anything I had ever known. The sounds alone were enough to drive a man mad. The screaming of the wounded, the crash of stones against the walls, the twang of bowstrings and the whistle of arrows. But I loaded my crossbow and shot, loaded and shot, until my arms ached and my hands bled, and I saw them fall. I saw the great Mongol warriors, who had destroyed kingdoms, fall like any other man when an iron bolt takes him in the chest." The assault continued for hours, then days. The Mongols threw everything they had at the walls. They brought up their siege tower, a massive structure that had taken weeks to build, only to have it burned by defenders who lobbed fire pots, ceramic vessels filled with burning pitch and oil, onto its wooden frame. The tower collapsed in flames, taking dozens of attackers with it. They attempted to mine under the walls, digging tunnels that could be collapsed to breach the fortifications. But the defenders countermined, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Mongol sappers, fighting brutal underground battles in the darkness with knives and short swords in spaces so confined that a man could barely turn around. Europe had been saved, not by a single great battle, not by a heroic king leading a mighty army, but by the stubborn resistance of a few thousand people behind the walls of a city most Europeans had never heard of. The defense of Olomouc stands as a testament to what determination, good preparation, and the right technology deployed at the right time can accomplish against overwhelming odds. The siege also highlights something often overlooked in discussions of medieval warfare: the critical importance of logistics. The Mongol failure at Olomouc was not primarily a failure of tactics or courage. It was a failure of sustainability. Their army required resources that the siege environment could not provide. Their horses needed pasture that was not available. Their strategic doctrine of rapid mobile warfare could not be executed in a static siege situation. And their supply lines, stretched across thousands of miles back to Central Asia, could not support an extended campaign in the agriculturally poor regions of Central Europe. This logistical reality is something modern military strategists still study. The principle that an army cannot function effectively if separated from its supply base, that even the most formidable military force can be defeated by denying it the resources it needs to operate. These are lessons as relevant today as they were in 1241. There is something profoundly human about the story of Olomouc. These were not professional soldiers with years of training and combat experience, not for the most part. They were ordinary people, shopkeepers and craftsmen, farmers who had fled to the city for protection, clergy who had never expected to hold weapons in anger. And yet when their world was threatened, when the choice was to resist or die, they found within themselves a strength they did not know they possessed. One of the most moving accounts from the siege comes from a letter written by a priest who survived. He describes standing on the walls on what everyone believed would be the final day of the siege, watching another Mongol assault forming up, believing that this time the walls would be breached and every soul in the city would be slaughtered. He wrote, "I prayed for God's mercy, and I prayed for a quick death. But then I looked at the men around me, my brothers in Christ, men I had known my whole life, and I saw no fear in their eyes. I saw determination, I saw faith, and I knew that whatever happened, we would face it together, and that was enough." They held that day, and the next, until the day they looked out and saw the Mongol camp being dismantled, the great host preparing to leave. The priest wrote later, "We had been given a miracle, not the miracle of divine intervention, with angels descending from heaven to smite our enemies, but the miracle of human courage, of strong walls built by skilled hands, of weapons forged with care and used with precision. God helped those who helped themselves, and we had helped ourselves very well indeed." The legacy of Olomouc extends beyond the military and strategic lessons. It became a symbol, a story told and retold across medieval Europe, of how a small group of determined people could stand against the storm. It inspired other cities facing similar threats. It gave hope in what seemed like a hopeless situation, and it reminded everyone that history is not predetermined, that the outcome is not decided until the very end, that there is always a chance if you are willing to fight for it. The weapons, tactics, and fortifications that proved decisive at Olomouc would evolve and change over the coming centuries. Crossbows would be replaced by firearms. Stone walls would be superseded by bastions and earthworks designed to withstand artillery. The nature of warfare itself would transform beyond recognition. But the fundamental principles, preparation, determination, understanding your strengths and your enemy's weaknesses, these would remain constant. Today, Olomouc is a beautiful historical city, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, known for its stunning Baroque architecture and vibrant cultural life. Tourists walk its streets, admiring the astronomical clock and the Holy Trinity column, often without realizing that they are walking on ground where one of history's most significant sieges took place. The walls that held back the Mongol advance are largely gone now, replaced by parks and modern buildings, but the memory remains. There are memorials and plaques that commemorate the siege, though they are not as prominent as one might expect for an event of such historical importance. Perhaps that is fitting. The defense of Olomouc was not about glory or recognition, it was about survival. It was about ordinary people doing what had to be done because there was no alternative. And in that sense, it represents the best of human nature, the capacity to face overwhelming danger with courage and resourcefulness. The question of what would have happened if Olomouc had fallen quickly is one of history's great counterfactuals. Would the Mongols have conquered all of Central Europe? Would Vienna, Prague, and the German cities have fallen? Would Western European civilization, as we know it, have been fundamentally altered? We cannot know for certain, but we can look at what happened in regions the Mongols did conquer, how those societies were transformed, often traumatically, and we can appreciate what was preserved by the resistance at Olomouc and other fortified cities that held the line. The Mongol, the catastrophic shock of the initial invasion was never repeated, and that breathing space, that opportunity to adjust and prepare, was bought with the blood and sweat of the defenders of Olomouc and the other cities that refused to surrender. In a broader sense, the siege of Olomouc reminds us that history is shaped not just by the actions of kings and generals, not just by great battles and dramatic turning points, but also by the quiet courage of people whose names we will never know. The crossbowman who stood his post day after day, hands blistered, arms aching, maintaining his section of the wall. The women who carried water and food to the defenders, who cared for the wounded, who kept the city functioning under siege conditions. The craftsmen who worked through the night manufacturing weapons and repairing equipment. The priests who maintained morale and faith when it seemed that all was lost. These people, whose individual stories are lost to time, collectively wrote a chapter of history that changed the trajectory of an entire continent. They proved that technology, when properly employed, could counter even the most overwhelming force. They demonstrated that fortifications, often dismissed by military historians as passive and defensive, could be as decisive as the most brilliant tactical maneuver in open battle. They showed that an army's greatest strength could become its greatest weakness when the conditions changed. The Mongols were perhaps the finest light cavalry force in history, but at Olomouc, they could not use their horses. They were masters of the compound bow, but crossbows fired from behind stone walls proved more effective. They had conquered the largest land empire ever assembled, but they could not take one fortified city in Moravia. This is not to diminish Mongol achievements or suggest that they were somehow inferior warriors. They were extraordinary, and their impact on world history cannot be overstated. But even the greatest military forces have limitations, and Olomouc revealed those limitations with brutal clarity. The siege also demonstrates the critical importance of leadership in desperate situations. Bishop Bruno and Yaroslav of Sternberg could have chosen to surrender. Many would have considered it the sensible option. The Mongols had offered terms. Resistance seemed suicidal. But they chose to fight, and they convinced the city to fight with them. They organized the defense brilliantly, used their resources efficiently. And maintained discipline and morale through weeks of terrifying combat. In the end, the siege of Olomouc is a story about the intersection of technology, geography, timing, and human will. Remove any one of those elements, and the outcome might have been very different. If the city had not been so well fortified, if the defenders had not possessed such effective weapons, if the surrounding countryside had provided better pasture for Mongol horses, if Ogedei Khan had not died when he did, if the defenders had lost hope and surrendered, history would have taken a different path. But all of those elements aligned in one specific place, at one specific time, creating a perfect storm of circumstance that stopped what had seemed unstoppable. That is the nature of history, It is not inevitable. It is not predetermined. It is the result of countless decisions and chances and accidents, all colliding in ways that shape the future. The people defending Olomouc in 1241 could not have known that they were saving Europe. They were just trying to survive the next day and then the day after that. But their individual decisions to stand and fight, to reload one more crossbow, to repair one more breach in the wall, to hold out for one more week, those decisions accumulated into something larger than any of them could have imagined. This is the secret weapon that destroyed the Mongol advance. Not a specific technology or tactic, though both played their part. The secret weapon was the human capacity to endure, to resist, to fight on when all logic says you should surrender. It was the determination of a few thousand people who decided that their walls would stand, their city would survive, and the Mongol tide would break upon their defenses. They were right, and Europe would never be the same.